167 individuals went from wellness to one chronic disease. 30 went to cancer, and we looked at 10 of these, and we examined the bloods prior to their clinical diagnosis and showed one, in all 10 cases, there were a cluster of proteins that came up from 1 to 4 years before clinical diagnosis, and two, many of those proteins mapped into disease-perturbed networks known to be associated with a particular kind of cancer. So what we can do in a million-person project where we'll have 200,000 of these transitions over 10 years we can characterize is, one, we can begin to identify for all the major chronic diseases the proteins that come up. And then we can use those proteins to go and find the very earliest disease-perturbed network, and we can focus therapies on that.
Welcome to the Precision Medicine Made Simple podcast, where we simplify the complex world of precision medicine. We're here to explore how personalized healthcare can empower you to understand and improve your health to live a longer and healthier life. Join us as we break down the latest in medical science into actionable insights. Let's make precision medicine accessible and actionable for everyone. This episode is sponsored by Biography Health, where DNA-powered healthcare is designed just for you. Biography Health is a HIPAA-compliant precision medicine platform that equips providers with AI-driven recommendations powered by your genetics, health history, and clinical insights, all while keeping data private, secure, and independent from large EHR systems. If you're a provider ready to bring precision medicine into your practice, visit biographyhealth.com to learn more. Or if you're a patient who wants your doctor to explore this, point them our way. We'll help them bring personalized healthcare to life. As a reminder, this episode is for educational purposes only. This episode is in no way a replacement for professional health advice. Please consult with your professional primary care provider for medical advice. If at any point you feel that a topic discussed on our podcast was misrepresented, or if you have additional insights that could enhance our discussions, we wholeheartedly encourage you to reach out to us. Your feedback is invaluable in helping us improve and in ensuring our content remains both informative and reflective of the latest developments in precision medicine. And for today's guest, he is our most influential guest we've had on the show. His work helped make modern genomics possible. The automated DNA and related instrument platforms he and his teams developed massively accelerated our ability to read biology, fueling the Human Genome Project and the genomic testing many of us now take for granted. He went on to co-found the Institute for Systems Biology to unite engineers, biologists, and clinicians, work that gave rise to what he calls P4 medicine, care that's predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory. He's been recognized at the very highest levels, awarded the United States National Medal of Science at the White House by President Barack Obama, and is among the rare scientists elected to all 3 U.S. national academies, which include sciences, engineering, and medicine. He helps translate these ideas for all of us through his book, The Age of Scientific Wellness, which has been embraced across academic medical centers, longevity circles, and health tech communities. His mission is to transform reactive, disease-first, sick care into proactive, data-rich scientific wellness that helps people prevent disease, extend health span, and stay healthier longer. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Leroy Hood.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. Hood.
My pleasure. Yeah.
I really appreciate you here. So one thing that we always like to start off with this show is the transition point. And as I was looking at your journey, from academia and looking through all the things that you've accomplished, you've also received so much pushback along the way too. And so I'm just curious what and when that transition point was like, if it was like a specific experience with a patient or in school, and then what was some of the pushback that you've received?
Well, I think for me, the largest professional transition point occurred in 1970. I was a young assistant professor at Caltech. And like all young assistant professors, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my future, because then it was an open book. What you could go, you could write grants, you could do where and when to go. And I decided that for most of my earlier career, that what fascinated me most was biological complexity. The absolutely bewildering array of different traits that have to go together to make an individual what they are. And I decided that complexity is what I really wanted to study. And in 1970, there were 2 big deficiencies with that way of thinking. One was, how could you even begin to think about deciphering complexity? And that was when I decided big data was necessary to deconvolute the complexity of human biology, but the instrumentation for big data didn't exist at that point in time. And the second question that came up and started me thinking was, if we have all of this big data from humans, what do we do with it to try and figure out how we can uh, deal with that complexity? And what emerged from that thinking was the whole idea of systems biology, that is, looking at the problem in its global context, holistic, global, hierarchical, integrative, all of those different features. How did we put all that together? And that later came to be called systems biology. In coming to Caltech, I had in my earlier years studied the immune system and how diversity is generated in the immune system to handle the whole universe of infectious and
Different
cancerous agents and everything. And what was clear from those studies was the enormous complexity. All the simple first solutions one came to in trying to decipher how antibodies generated all of their diversity to handle bacteria turned out to be too simple. And in fact, the closest to the truth was every time we learned something new, it was a fundamental part of the mechanism that got added in. So I was really convinced that on the one hand, we had to have a detailed understanding of biology so we appreciated the complexity and didn't trivialize it, which is what many people convinced AI is going to rule the world are doing now, and they're going to be wrong. And we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, the second thing is I decided to set up in my lab a cross-disciplinary culture that brought in scientists of biology and chemistry and mathematics and physics. And we brought in some that come from astronomy,
Right.
computer science. And together, we, over a period of about 30-some years, generated 6 instruments that allowed us to manipulate the informational molecules of life to sequence and synthesize DNA and sequence and synthesize proteins and then other kinds of things. And this technology laid the foundation during that period of time for modern biology in terms of molecular biology and so forth. But it was really key to solving the big data problem and being able to generate from a single individual enormous amounts of data. And in fact, this quest for solving biological complexity took me through actually 7 really interesting paradigm changes. That is, changes that caused us to alter how we look at biology and how we practice biology and or medicine. And the first, of course, was the instrumentation. And I will say, in biology at Caltech, which was an absolutely superb department, there was enormous reservation about my having a large lab, and I needed to have all these cross-disciplinary people, and B, pushing all these different technologies. And in fact, the senior faculty early on in my career came to the chairman of biology and said, let's move him into engineering. And the chair came to me and said, I'll give you the choice. Would you like to go to engineering? I said, no, I want to do biology. I want students who will know about the complexities of biology to apply these things. So anyway, you talked about pushback earlier on. That was real pushback. And in fact, we created facilities that let the biologists there do all sorts of things, and they were not very appreciative about that kind of thing at all. The second paradigm change really set them off, though, and that was one of the instruments, the automated DNA sequencer, got me invited to the first meeting ever held on the Human Genome Project. 12 of us went to Santa Cruz and debated whether it was feasible, whether it was a good idea, and we actually came to polar conclusions. Six felt all of us felt it was feasible. It could be done, but difficult. But we were split on whether it was a good idea. Those opposed, and that was about half of us, felt that big science would destroy small science, and we couldn't let it slip under the tent and get in the door. And of course, that was nonsense. The big science of the Genome Project revolutionized so many fields of biology in profound ways that it's really quite remarkable. But the real thing that and we debated for almost 5 years before we finally got people to accept the idea that we could set up a $3 billion project over a 15-year period, which is what we'd earlier said. And it ended up working out to finish a few years early and everything. And it was on budget and on time. And the human genome absolutely transformed our understanding of how we can think about human biology. It gave us essentially the way to begin thinking about the potential each of us has in our health trajectories. And so after clash with the biology department over big science and technology.
And when you say big science, you're talking about integrating these interdisciplinary fields.
People together, yeah. I proposed to biology department, I said, okay, let me make another applied biology department at Caltech where rather than having all these different disciplines within my lab, we have a faculty that represent each of the different disciplines, and we work together. And I said that could be very much more effective. And biology said, no way. And, it was obvious they didn't want another biology department competing with them.
Right.
But at the same time, when I pushed this idea of a genome project, the senior biologist almost universally disagreed with that too. And that was when I decided, gee, if you really want to have fun with science, you can't do it at a place where people are criticizing two of the major thrusts in your laboratory, right? So I looked at a number of different possibilities, including UCLA and Berkeley. And Bill Gates made it possible to move in 1992 to the University of Washington Medical School and to set up the first cross-disciplinary department ever established. And it actually, in the 8 years of its existence, was spectacular. Two of the faculty developed the first two techniques of the newly emerging field of proteomics.
Right.
A third faculty wrote the two key software pieces for the Genome Project, that is, the quality of DNA sequence and how you assembled all the fragments and pieces together. It was where we invented the inkjet technology, which allowed you to synthesize millions of fragments of DNA very rapidly and very easily. And we use that in a drug company we'll maybe talk about a little bit later on. But anyway, this department was enormously successful, except for one thing.
What's that?
And when I'd gone there, I really wanted to embed it around this idea that had really emerged then of systems biology. And it turned out that a big state university with its bureaucracies is absolutely stultifying with regard to new kinds of ideas and their emergence. And, after 8 years, I decided if we're ever going to start systems biology, I'd have to resign.
Was it more of that pushback against big science in that environment?
No, I think the faculty really liked the things I was doing. It was the administration that wanted to control me in ways that were inappropriate. So, for example, at that time, I probably knew Bill Gates as well as any person in the whole medical school. He'd moved me up. I'd had personal interactions with him. They forbid me to ever ask him for a penny without permission. And, a new department needs those kind of things. And they weren't going to be able to ask for those things because they didn't know what they were. Or I remember the time when I spent a year and a half recruiting this absolutely spectacular cell surface biologist from Penn State, and he finally agreed to come. And the dean came roaring over to my office and he said, "So tell me why cell surface chemistry has any relationship to medicine." And I said, "It's going to transform diagnostics. And diagnostics is a key part of." Didn't buy it at all. He was an
Oh, wow.
outcomes guy. He knew no science. And I said, "Okay, I'll use my Gates endowment." And he said, "No, you won't. I'm the dean. I control all the money, including your endowment." And he said, "I won't give you permission to do it." And that really was the straw that broke my back. And I decided if I was ever going to do something new, I'd have to break away. And I did in 2000 and started the Institute for Systems Biology, which is the fourth big paradigm change. And in a very short period of time, we showed the power of understanding biology and the power of understanding disease by targeting two model systems in mice with system studies. And this kind of broke open the whole field, and lots of people started doing it. And
Can you
actually,
expand on that a little bit? That
sure, just
Yeah.
what I did. So one thing we did was we studied glucose, galactose metabolism in yeast, and we analyzed all the networks that operated within the yeast to utilize galactose. And for the first time, we had a global picture of how all that worked. Never had been seen before. And the second one was, and what was nice about it is you could induce it to do things, and then we looked at the dynamics and explained them. And we did exactly the same thing with scrapie disease in mice, which is a neurodegenerative
Right.
disease caused by prions. And what we were able to demonstrate there, it was a disease in mice that took its course in about, 30 weeks or so. So we could follow it from its initiation all the way to its termination. And we saw that there were four major networks of behaviors that were successively recruited together to cause all of the pathophysiology that was known of scrapie disease. I mean, it explained it just absolutely beautifully for the first time. And it was clear these were keys to the kingdom and beginning to understand biological complexity and everything. And then in the early 2000s, the fifth paradigm change was when I started thinking about healthcare and asked, what are the ideal attributes for healthcare? And I argued they are prediction, prevention, personalization. Those three things have to do with science, okay? And participation, and that has to do with persuading individuals to become stewards of their own health and to do the things that are good for them. And I'll say we know how to do the first three P's pretty well now. The fourth P involves education, it involves psychology, it involves sociology, and it involves economics. Economics are going to be key
Because what can
in
the
persuading
patient, what's
us.
the patient willing to do? What can they do?
Exactly. Those are really important kinds of things. But what happened then is I started, in the context of P4 medicine, putting a whole series of applications about new strategies and technologies for doing P4 medicine into NIH, and I got terrible scores on them because they said, "You're arguing for things that are so far in the future, they aren't worth funding now."
They fund the status quo.
You have to have it half done before you got,
Right.
Anyway, what I started doing then, and it was really an interesting experience. I decided I would go to countries and see if I could persuade each country in turn that we would be willing to start a systems biomedicine institute for them and bring them to the forefront of biology and medicine if in return they would give us the resources to develop the P4 strategy. So I went first to Israel, And we got very far along, and at the last minute, the big fundraiser for Jewish American funds came and said, I can raise the money for Israel. I can't raise the money for ISB. So, and then I had really a wonderful flirtation with Ireland. It failed basically because Trinity, the best university in Ireland, didn't want someone like ISB to come in and help them. They wanted to do things themselves. So they vetoed this proposal of there'd be a competition. We would help each of the 4 major teams, and then we'd work with the winner to develop the right thing. So that got vetoed. They had the competition, and the international judges said all of these things are so mediocre, none of them should be funded. So they delayed years. And then I went to Canada, and I won't even go into the details there. It was an exciting place to go because Calgary had all of this oil money and something called the Heritage Foundation, and they seemed willing to spend it on science. But with that endeavor, it was death by democracy. I never met a Canadian in that series of meetings that could ever sit down and make a real decision. So I just finally gave
It's
up.
reflected in the quality of the beer that comes out of there also, by the way.
I won't comment on that. But you know what finally happened is I had a really good friend at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he came to me and he said, you know, Lee, Luxembourg has this incredible minister of economy, and he's the driver in the government, and he's determined to bring medicine and healthcare there. He said, I'll connect you. Why don't you have a conversation and see what comes of it? So is Minister Kreka and I talked for about 40 minutes, and at the end of it, he said, I really like these ideas. Why don't you put in a proposal? And I said, so how much money are we talking about? And he said, how much money do you need? I said, well, we'll start with 100 million. He said, fine, write it up. We got 100 million. And in a period of 3 or 4 years, we'd done a lot of the P4 strategies that in 2014 placed us in a position where I could recruit 108 of my friends and do a genome-phenome analysis, the genome once, and then the phenome for 3 times during the year to prove whether this data-driven health is going to work. And the results of that analysis were absolutely...
What were the analytes you chose for that?
So what we looked at, we measured 4 major features. So one, we did the whole genome sequence, so we knew all the variants and all. Then number 2, we chose 3 analytes from the blood, the clinical chemistries, the proteins, and we looked at about 500 at that time, and the metabolites. And again, we looked at about 700 at that time. And then we looked at the gut microbiome by sequencing and characterizing the species. And then we looked at normal physiology with the Fitbit, so we could measure activity and sleep and things like that. So those were the features that we measured, and we were able to demonstrate remarkable improvements in using those measurements to uniquely define for individuals actionable possibilities that can either optimize their wellness and or let them avoid disease. And from that 6th paradigm change, we were actually able to say, look, there are 8 major different categories of actionable possibilities. Each of them represents hundreds, if not thousands, of actionable possibilities. And what using these for each individual can do is take you far beyond the classic traditional health that comes from thinking about exercise, diet, sleep, and stress. All of those are important, but that's the core on which you build beyond the future that is going to, once we roll this out completely, let our health span equal our lifespan and extend both out into the 90s or beyond. Okay. That's my big kind of goal. So this was an exciting idea. We started a company called Aerovale. It lasted for 4 years. We gathered 5,000 people and the data on them, and it was those data that gave us now almost 30 papers where we looked at different bits and pieces that came out of that population of individuals that told us about optimizing health and avoiding disease.
And this is in the pre-AI era, so that sounds like a ton of data to analyze.
We're good at analyzing data. We analyzed a ton of data. And of course, going from 108 people to 5,000 people, that was an enormous increase in analysis time, but in opportunity as well. So we clearly laid out options that there are, for example, in your genome, 8 different categories of actionable possibilities, almost none of which are utilized today.
Can you list those off?
Well, one is the American Medical College has identified 81 variants, which, if you have it, here are things you can do to prevent and or avoid or ameliorate the disease, okay? And those in a population collectively hit 3 to 5% of the individuals. So even those alone
Those
are
are
worth
those single gene variants,
single gene variants,
yep.
monogenic variants. A second thing that is really going to be important are polygenic scores, which allow us for each individual to determine the genetic risk for normal physiology types and disease physiology types. And it's individuals that are at very high risk for these things, as we showed beautifully with the LDL example. High-risk people that have high LDL can only bring it down with statins chemistry. Low-risk people with high LDL bring it down beautifully with exercise and diet.
Interesting.
So for each of these polygenic scores, one, you have to treat the high and low risk people differently.
Yeah.
Okay. But two,
I use those scores all the time. I did not know that, what
Yeah.
you just said.
but two, if you have a high risk score for LDL cholesterol, the really interesting question is, when does it manifest itself? And the only way you can answer that question is to look at the LDL all the way across the longitudinal life of a person, right? And we had in the first set of 108 people an individual whose 3 father side things all had died of heart attacks before they were 50. So when he was in his teens, he started doing his blood LDL cholesterol. And what he saw was really striking. It was rock flat up until the mid-30s, and it spiked suddenly.
Yeah.
And when it spiked, he was young, athletic, he played soccer, he hadn't changed his diet. It was something that programmed this thing. And the only thing that brought it down were steroids, were statins.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have a high risk, we need these blood analytes to follow and say, when am I going to get kidney disease? When am I going to get breast cancer? And once you know that starts to come from the analyte changes, you can start to make corrective actions.
So it's really, you personalize the patient and then you predict what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Okay, what's the third?
Wait, I have a question on polygenic risk scores really quickly, just because there has been, some of the common, objection or pushback when it comes to polygenic risk scores is the population it's based off of, right?
Oh, very
So I've
important.
heard that it's mostly based off of, let's say, a European population. Could that still apply to somebody that isn't European then, where we don't have that much data to represent that specific population?
So with a small amount of data with the other population, we can make the corrections that'll be necessary to use them. So the answer is quite correct. Most 85% of what we have in polygenic scores comes from Caucasian European descent. But we'll make those corrections and be able to each uniquely define the populations. And it's much more subtle than just saying you're African American or you're Caucasian. Because if you look in America today,
Yeah.
many of us are 3 or 4 different things. So the last category of things are the categories of ancestry determinants. So, for example, for Alzheimer's disease, the major causative factor for Alzheimer's disease in Caucasians, genetic factor, is a variant of the APO compound called ApoE4, okay? And if you're homozygous for it, you have enormously increased risk for Alzheimer's in Caucasians over other things. What is really interesting is if you look in the Japanese population, it's 3 times as bad for them. If you look in the Hispanic population, it doesn't make any difference. So
Or in
you
Nigerian or something
or something
also.
like
Yeah.
that. So really
Is
what you need to know is that variant in the context of the other things that lead to or prevent what's going on. And that's what these ancestry-related things are going. That's number 8. But then the next category are the genes that block the application and use of drugs. Pharmacogenomics, it's called. And there are many that undeniably manifest theirself in blocking really commonly used drugs and so forth. They're almost never given out. So that's another category. The next one is something called rare diseases now, where there are single gene defects that cause a disease in maybe 1 in 20,000 people, but in the entire population, perhaps 30% of the population will have one or more of those rare genes. So you should always be checked for those.
like that carrier status, so to speak.
Well, no, that's the next thing. The Mendelian carrier status is really important because what we demonstrated in Airvale beautifully is we had 9 people that were homozygous for the variant that should cause hemochromatosis.
Heterozygous.
Homozygous.
Homozygous.
Now, okay.
Okay.
And only 3 of the 9 got the
Actually had it.
high levels of iron that are characteristic of the disease. That is, there were blocking genes there, okay?
Oh.
And conversely, in those that had 1 bad copy of that gene,
They'll have some
out of
iron overload.
25, we had 9 that had high levels of iron. So you can either have 1 or 2 bad copies and you'll get it or not, but you should follow the analytes that tell us whether you're going to get it and make the adjustments. And with hemochromatosis, all you have to do to fix it early is bloodletting that brings down the iron levels and everything.
And stay away from those cast iron skillets.
Stay away from cast iron skillets and
Really?
things.
Yeah.
So,
Like,
yeah.
oh, wow. All
So
right.
anyway, those and the final category, the 7th of the 8 categories, are basically lifestyle genetics, which we're coming to understand more and more about. For example, there are several hundred variants now that control your potential for athletic injuries, ACL tears, groin pulls.
So we can believe those
So if you-
those fitness reports, those genetic fitness reports. There's some significant there.
There's a significant there because if you know you have ACL tear things, there are exercises you can do that enormously reduce the probability it'll happen. I remember going to Pete Carroll and the Seahawks and making this really big pitch for, with these lifestyle things, we can warn people that are at risk for these damages, and we can try and repair them. And the players wouldn't hear of it because they were terrified if their employers knew they had these genetic risks.
Massive.
They'd go for someone else who didn't.
That's a
And
HIPAA
so
violation.
I never
yeah.
stood a chance on that
Oh
one.
wow.
Yeah. But for a lot of athletes now, they are taking advantage of these things, and they do make a difference. So look, In the genome alone, there are tens of thousands of actionable possibilities we can apply to individuals with. And that's also true a whole series of other things we've looked at with regard to the phenome. And the clinical chemistry supplied almost all of the 200 actionable possibilities we had in Airvale. And you can see already we're way beyond those, and we have all sorts of possibilities. Once we get these organized, we can deliver to groups that are interested in taking advantage of the deep dive into an individual's health and the optimization of wellness and the avoidance of disease. And let me say something about a second thing we discovered in the Airvale population is that 167 individuals went from wellness to one chronic disease. 30 went to cancer, and we looked at 10 of these, and we examined the bloods prior to their clinical diagnosis and showed one, in all 10 cases, there were a cluster of proteins that came up from 1 to 4 years before clinical diagnosis. And two, many of those proteins mapped into disease-perturbed networks known to be associated with a particular kind of cancer. So what we can do in a 1 million-person project where we'll have 200,000 of these transitions over 10 years we can characterize is one, we can begin to identify for all the major chronic diseases the proteins that come up. And then we can use those proteins to go and find the very earliest disease-perturbed network, and we can focus therapies on that and reverse that early transition before it ever manifests clinically. And to show how important on the economic side this is, 86% of our $4.5 trillion budget is spent on chronic diseases. And suppose in 10 years we could eliminate 50% of those, you'd be talking about trillions of dollars of savings. And that begins to make an impact on arguing for a health care that is focused on optimizing wellness and avoiding disease rather than our current 98% of the healthcare focused on disease.
I'm going to segue you into the next question that I know Taylor had showed me that questions we definitely want to get to. What are the obstacles to that? What's the obstacles to doing this type of deep analysis, being predictive? The science is there, right?
Yeah.
And we certainly have the ability to draw blood and do assays and do sequencing.
The difficulty is the fourth P. First of all, how do you persuade patients to do these things? How do you persuade them, look, they're the master of your health, and it's their obligation to educate themselves on how they can optimize their health and then carry those things out. That is, for children, we've set up a course to do that looks like it's working very well in the local high schools in Seattle. But for adults, how do you pull someone away from an NBA game to think about wellness? And, in part for adults is I'd rather enjoy something now than have something in the future.
Well, I mean, that's a human trait.
It's a human trait.
I mean, that evolved.
And see, what we showed with Airvale is even in the very earliest beginning, by measuring these blood analytes, we can correlate with all the improvements in diabetes and cardiovascular disease and early Alzheimer's. All of these things can give you immediate gratification. And the next major class of actionable possibilities that's really interesting is we've used the blood analytes to plot the physiologic health trajectories for a whole series of different things now. So we can do biological age, and with the biological age metric, and we could do that from
methylation,
proteins, metabolites, clinical chemistries, or combinations. But what they showed in Airvale is On average, each individual that stayed in the program for a year lost a year plus of biological age. And of course, the younger you become with respect to the chronologic age, the better you're aging. We had one individual who lost 10 years in 4 years. So how far you can push it down, we don't know, but most people are a long ways from where they should be, that's for sure. We have a second metric that can beautifully measure your metabolism at the instant. The classic way we measure metabolism is height and BMI, and it's inaccurate. It's totally wrong in 20-30% of the time, and it doesn't respond to changes at all. This is an instantaneous assessment of metabolism. And a new one we're working on, and it's just about finished, is we can measure frailty in the individual, and it's especially important in older folks to be able to say, your frailty is not increasing. And frailty has to do with a lot of different kinds of measurements, and we've integrated those together into the metabolites. We can do the same for the immune system and inflammation. We can do the same for cognition. We can measure 25 different cognitive features across time, and where you're deficient in one of those features, we have a means for correcting it because the brain has enormous plasticity. So there are all sorts of new actionable possibilities. And of course, one that is really interesting is the ability to integrate what we call scientific wellness, which is this broad global use of all these measurements we make to assess your health, with the much more focused geroscience approach to looking individually at the 12 hallmarks of aging, or 14, how many ever there are. And we recently had a partnership with the Buck Institute where we actually plan to integrate together these two things so we can assume both in wellness. And if we succeed in doing that, I'm quite confident we can begin to start saying to people, if you're willing to follow these prescriptions, we can guarantee you'll have a health span that takes you into the 90s or beyond. And, one of the really striking statistics that's come out recently is over the last 40 years, Americans extended their lifespan by 10 years, okay? They didn't extend their health span by a single year. So it means most of the people that are in extended lifespan are caretakers or they're being taken care of. So that's why it's critical that health span be coincidental with lifespan, and that's the big initiative that we're all about. So there are tens of thousands of new actionable possibilities. We haven't even begun to apply even common, easy ones to people. So how are we going to go about making the change from Aerovale, which dipped its toe in the water and found 200 things with these clinical chemistries, and now we have hundreds of thousands of things with big data?
How do you bring this down to something practical? So, practical that you can implement to a panel of patients that a doctor might have in their practice for a pretty finite amount of money. So in other words, you're going to have to pick and choose among that. How would you rank the things that you would do for a patient if you had, I don't know, $3,000 or $5,000 to spend per year on the patient? What would you do?
Well, we can talk about money separately, but I think what we're setting up to do now is to create an AI company that is going to successively deliver packages of new actionable possibilities. We have 200 from Aerovale that are well taken care of. We'll probably put another 200 of the next easiest things together in a simple package. And in that simple package, it'll do two important things. The package will go to the doctor and will say, your patient has this actionable possibility, and you'll describe the actionable possibility and what it'll do for the patient. And then you'll give the physician the clinical evidence that it's validated and so forth. And then you'll make a simpler version to go to the patient. So we're setting a company called Phenoma AI to deliver packages of actionable possibilities. And we hope within the next 6 months to have the first simple
What's
set.
the input though? What's the input to the AI from the patient?
So the input is taking essentially all of the actionable possibilities that we've talked about here and putting them into knowledge graphs, which connect them to all of biological information, the biological networks, the biological communities, all these different kinds of things. And that extended broad knowledge then will be given to as training for the transformer, for the AI agent that is going to then be able to look at the unique features of the genome and phenome of each individual and map them into those actionable possibilities.
That's
Okay?
fantastic.
So it absolutely is going to transform medicine. And what it's going to do is it's going to make super doctors because they'll be able to have clinical expertise in broad fields of medicine they never know anything about. And imagine what it can do for treating patients. And you'd have right at your hands all the evidence and the justification and the nature of things like that. And at the same time, what we've done is we've created a chatbot where we've taken all the different things I've written in the lectures I've given and really the data on genome and phenome that's out there. And this chatbot now has to do at the level of a patient, can answer any question on this data-driven health. So tell me why I should fix this variant in my genome, and it'll give you a simple explanation of why and the implications of that immediately and long term. Okay? All the things that patient and the immediate actions are really important because you have to give people instant gratification. At the same time, you're
Delaying
extending
chronic
health
disease
span and all that kind of thing.
I'm still curious about it. Still, there needs to be this personalization piece of, quantifying or understanding the patient. So in a practical sense, what data are you pulling? What labs are you getting? Whole genome sequencing, PGX, PRS. You need all of that though to understand the patient to turn the chatbot loose on them, right?
Well, ideally, what I'd like to be able to do is generate 10 to 100 times more data on each individual than we did for Aerovale. Now,
That's a
the
lot.
cost is a lot of data, but we can handle the data. That's not the problem.
Okay, cost.
The problem is the cost. And here's the real paradox on cost. If we go from handling hundreds to thousands of people to handling hundreds of millions of people, the cost of phenomics is going to come down just like the cost of genomics came down. In a 20-year period, we can argue that the first genome cost $1 billion to sequence, okay? We can do a genome now for $100, all right? So that's a factor of 10 to the seventh or so. And for the phenome, I think within the next 3 or 4 years, as we move from maybe thousands of individuals into tens to hundreds of thousands of individuals, the phenome will come down by 2 orders of magnitude. What we'd really like to be able to do now, kind of in every kind of thing, is maybe $5,000 or $6,000, but there we'd be talking about $5 or $6 if it came down a couple of orders of magnitude. So,
Right.
see, what we have to do is jumpstart the whole process with a national program where the Human Genome Initiative is a beautiful continuous extension of the first Genome Project, and its objective is to prime the pump to get millions of individuals with genomes and phenomes. And then all of a sudden, the cost comes roaring down. And at the same time, over a 10-year period, you unequivocally show and demonstrate the health of individuals has improved markedly. You can even make measurements of health span and things like that. You need to be able to show that the cost of doing this is going to end up saving American medicine enormous amounts of money because we're going to get rid of chronic disease. We're going to be able today, if you take the 10 most common drugs in the pharma repertoire, you can argue that one person in 10 responds effectively to them. And all the other 90%, not only does it cost extra money, it exposes you to the side effects of these drugs. With data-driven health, we'll be able to match perfectly drugs that'll work with individuals.
So that's
And
like Plavix is a
that's
pro-drug.
exactly,
And,
exactly. I mean, the drugs today are 600 billion plus, and suppose you got rid of 90% of that. So you're talking about a $500 billion.
So from a current societal U.S., where we are with the NIH and funding, and what do you think the appetite is to do something that would require this kind of investment now for a payoff down the road?
Well, I want to emphasize it isn't just to pay off down the road. Your health changes immediately, okay? And you have the payoff that'll come down the road. I think the appetite is going to be very great. For example, together with Turkey, we announced about 2 months ago in Pittsburgh a new international million-person project initiative focused on Asia because Asians have a lot of the right kind of traits in being themselves willing to pay something for their health care. And I think the governments with single payer systems have much easier ability to adopt these kind of things.
Right.
Look, we're a community where we have 1,000 princes, and each prince runs his or her healthcare system the way they want to run it. And some of them are good and some of them are miserable. But collectively, the healthcare in the U.S. is at the bottom of the top 20 developed countries, and we pay 3 times more than the next one. And you begin to ask yourself, gee, insurance companies, these middlemen really make a lot of money and they make a lot of the big decisions, don't they? That's all going to change in the future, I suspect.
Interesting. So do you see possibly the collapse of the commercial health insurance industry in the next 5 to 10 years compared to what it is today?
Let me say, I think the healthcare industry is going to have to adapt to a very different reality than they've adapted to now. And I can't even imagine what all those, I mean, imagine focusing on keeping people well and avoiding disease. I mean, that isn't how these people make money. I've gone and talked to a number of big healthcare companies, and uniformly, I've gotten the attitude, show me that within the next quarter you can make money for me, or I'm not interested. And of course, we're talking about a longer period of time than that. But if they maintain that anachronistic attitude, they'll be out of business. New AI-driven companies that'll be much more adaptable to the realities of wellness and prevention will replace them in a flash. But it's their choice. They can move ahead and help create a healthcare that deals in wellness and prevention, or they can maintain the status quo as they have for the past 10 years.
One of the two questions, and you can help me decide, it was going to be either about mental health or the BCP 551.
I've always been fascinated by Michael Merzenich pioneering work on something that's called Brain HQ, and you can go look that up and you'll come to a company called Posit. And it gives you a series of exercises that lets you assess more than 25 different cognitive kind of features. And what Merzenich got the Kevles Prize for, big prize in neurobiology, is for showing the brain as plastic, because what he demonstrated was fascinating. He said, for the ordinary person, your cognitive abilities slowly rise to a maximum in your early mid-30s. And for most people, you fade away and everything. And what he demonstrated is you could go to 80-year-olds that had lost a lot of their functional activity, and with the Brain HQ exercises, in many cases, elevate them back to a perfectly normal, acceptable status. So the brain is plastic, it can be changed, and the Brain HQ, if practiced in a regular period of time, can absolutely assure that you maintain cognitive features in an effective way you never yourself could do alone. One of the points Michael makes is one of the 25 features that is particularly important, cognitive features, is your reaction time. And he argues with the games that you can play to increase your reaction time that it actually drives the improvement of many of your other cognitive features. And actually, Tom Brady used Brain HQ in the last 7 or 8 years of his career to do two important things. One, he was a famous quarterback, as I think everybody
Well,
knows.
you're a famous quarterback also.
Hey, three and a half years, 3.5 years undefeated.
Yeah. So he increased his speed, his reaction time and everything, but he enormously increased his depth of field. And as a quarterback, you have to be able to assess all the options you have rapidly. And that's the kind of thing all of us can do if we wish. They can do remarkable things with memory. It's argued that this Brain HQ can actually give you diagnostic warnings when a person is moving toward depression, and there are things you can do to avoid it, or when, if you have the genetic predisposition, you're moving to an episode of schizophrenia. And again, there are things you might do to prevent. So there are two big things we can do for brain health. One, obviously, is cognition, and one is kind of executive function. They're both really important, but if I had to pick one, I'd pick cognition. I think us 87-year-olds need the cognition as long as we can possibly
keep it. You got the
it.
cognition of a 35-year-old. I bet you're about the same as your 35-year-old self. You've just seen a lot more stuff.
I've seen a lot more stuff, that's for sure.
Well, Dr. Hood, thank you so much for your time. It is 3:00. I feel like we're going to need to have you back for another episode just because there's so many other topics we could talk about. But
we can talk about drugs next time.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, drugs. Can't wait to talk about that. But yeah, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for
It's a real pleasure. Enjoyed chatting with you and everything.
Thanks for joining us on the Precision Medicine Made Simple podcast. If this episode inspired you to learn more about your health, please leave us a review and share the podcast with a friend. Your feedback helps spread the word about the power of precision medicine. Remember, taking action today can lead to a healthier tomorrow. See you next time.